Alexander Sullivan lived the American dream in plain sight. His corner office on the 40th floor of Wilson and Brooks overlooked the Manhattan skyline, a daily reminder of how far he had climbed. At 32, he had everything society expected: the tailored suits, the Upper East Side apartment, invitations to the right parties, and occasional dates with women his colleagues thought suitable. What Alexander truly excelled at wasn't corporate law, but invisibility, the art of being seen without ever being known. Each morning before dawn, he jogged through Central Park's winding paths, heart pounding, not from exertion but from fear. Fear that someone might recognize the careful armor he'd constructed was merely glass, ready to shatter with a single truth. In client meetings, he mentioned sports he never watched and women he never loved. At firm dinners, he laughed at jokes that cut like knives, his smile never reaching his eyes when partners joked about those rainbow people. In Wilson and Brooks's marble and mahogany halls, success flowed to those who fit the mold: family men with beautiful wives and respectable children, men who were everything Alexander pretended to be. Jessica was Alexander's only sanctuary. His older sister had found him crying in his college dorm room years ago, the confession spilling from his lips before he could stop it. "I like men, Jess, I always have." She had simply held him, her acceptance a lighthouse in a storm. Now she watched her brilliant brother slowly disappearing inside his perfect life, his laughter growing hollow with each passing year. The text came on a Tuesday. Blind date, Bluestone Cafe, West Village, 7 p.m., no arguments. Alexander nearly refused. West Village was dangerously close to the real him. But Jessica had added, "You deserve to breathe. Alex, just once." He arrived 15 minutes early, straightening his tie compulsively in the restaurant's warm amber light. When Matthew Reynolds approached, Alexander felt something shift. The man stood confidently in casual clothes that spoke of comfort in his own skin. His Irish features, auburn hair, green eyes that crinkled when he smiled, were striking. But it was his gaze that unsettled Alexander. Matthew looked at him like he was reading a familiar book. "Alexander Sullivan," Matthew said, his voice carrying no question, only recognition. "You don't remember me, do you?" Alexander searched the man's face, finding nothing familiar. "I'm sorry, have we met before?" Matthew's smile remained, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Westfield Academy, Boston, 15 years ago." He paused, watching realization crawl across Alexander's face. "I was the janitor's son." The carefully constructed world Alexander inhabited began to tremble. Memories surfaced like a body from dark water. Hallways he'd strutted through as royalty, classmates who'd bowed to his charm, and a skinny boy with haunted eyes who'd hugged the walls. A boy they'd called terrible names. A boy whose blood had stained the parking lot one spring afternoon, while Alexander had stood silently watching, doing nothing. If this story of masks we wear and truths we hide resonates with you, subscribe to Heart Stories for more journeys of courage and redemption. Because sometimes the most important person to recognize is the one we've been running from all along, ourselves. The Bluestone Cafe hummed with evening conversation, but Alexander heard nothing beyond the blood rushing in his ears. Matthew Reynolds, the janitor's son, sat across from him, years and worlds apart from the frightened boy he'd once been. Alexander's fingers trembled around his water glass as memories crystallized. Westfield Academy had been a temple of privilege, its brick walls housing the children of Boston's elite. Alexander had been their golden boy, Matthew, their shadow. "You were the scholarship kid," Alexander finally managed, his voice hollow. The one who cleaned the school with his father after hours," Matthew finished. "The one who wore secondhand uniforms. The one who came out at 15. His tone remained even, without self-pity. "The one your friends called fairy and trash, and worse things I won't repeat in this nice establishment." Alexander's carefully constructed poise cracked. "Matthew, I never called you those things." "No, you didn't," Matthew acknowledged, stirring his coffee. You just watched. You stood there with your perfect hair and your perfect future while they cornered me in hallways. You laughed when they taped slurs to my locker. You filmed with your phone when they pushed me down the stairs. Each accusation landed like physical blows. Alexander wanted to deny them, but truth had a weight he couldn't escape. He remembered watching, remembered laughing, remembered feeling a twisted relief that their attention was focused on someone else, someone who was everything he secretly was. Matthew leaned forward, his voice dropping. Do you remember what happened behind the April 7th, junior year? Alexander's mouth went dry. He did remember. Fragments, at least. Spring air carrying cheers from the baseball field. 5 members of the lacrosse team circling Matthew. Blood on concrete. They broke 3 of my ribs. Matthew continued when Alexander didn't respond. Fractured my cheekbone. I spent 4 days in the hospital. Nobody asked questions. Nobody came forward. His eyes never left Alexander's face. I saw you there, watching from behind the dumpsters. You did nothing. Shame engulfed Alexander like a physical wave. I was scared, he whispered. So was I. Matthew replied simply. The silence stretched between them, filled with 15 years of divergent paths. Matthew, now a high school English teacher whose calm demeanor spoke of hard-won peace. Alexander, partner track at a prestigious firm, living behind walls so high he could no longer see over them. Matthew studied him with sudden, gentle insight. You're still scared, aren't you? You're still hiding. Alexander's defenses rose instinctively. I don't know what you're talking about. You're gay, Alexander, just like me. The words hung in the air, a truth spoken aloud perhaps for the first time since that night with his sister. Alexander's denial formed and died on his lips. In Matthew's steady gaze, he saw something unexpected, not judgment or revenge, but recognition. The recognition of someone who had walked the same dark corridors of fear. How did you know? Alexander finally asked, his voice barely audible. I recognized the look, Matthew replied. The perfect performance, the careful distance. He smiled sadly. And Jessica told me, she's worried about you, says you're disappearing inside that suit. Alexander felt tears threatening. 15 years of careful construction, undone in minutes by the very person he'd helped victimize. Yet Matthew wasn't here to destroy him. That understanding slowly dawned, more terrifying than any revenge could have been. Matthew had come offering something far more dangerous than exposure, the possibility of truth. Rain pattered against the cafe windows as night settled over Manhattan. Alexander and Matthew had moved from their initial table to a quieter corner booth, empty coffee cups between them. 3 hours had passed like minutes, the restaurant gradually emptying around them. Only now did Matthew finally approach the memory that had haunted him most. The one night Alexander had shown him a different face. There's something else you don't remember, Matthew said softly. Something that happened after the beating. Alexander frowned. What are you talking about? Matthew's eyes grew distant, revisiting that night 15 years ago. It was raining, like tonight, 2 days after I got out of the hospital. Dad was working late, and I had to walk home, 3 miles in the dark with broken ribs, my face still swollen purple. His fingers traced unconscious patterns on the wooden table. I was passing by Jessica Winter's house, that big end-of-year party everyone talked about. Recognition flickered across Alexander's face. The party where Amanda Chen had broken up with him, where he'd gotten drunk for the first time, where he'd spent hours sitting alone on the front steps contemplating his carefully planned future. I tried to hurry past, Matthew continued, but you saw me. You called my name. Alexander shook his head slowly. I don't remember this. You were sitting alone, crying, I think. Matthew's voice remained gentle. You looked up and recognized me, even with my face bruised. You asked if I was okay, if it was safe for me to be walking alone. Something stirred in Alexander's memory, a rain-soaked figure limping past, familiar despite the injuries. A strange mixture of guilt and compassion. You gave me money for a taxi, Matthew said. Not just a few dollars, but 60. Everything in your wallet. You insisted, said it wasn't charity. Just one human being looking out for another. Alexander's throat tightened as fragmented memories aligned. I drove you to the hospital. Stayed all night. Matthew nodded. You paid my additional medical bills. Promised you'd testify against the boys who hurt me. His smile turned sad. But the next morning, you were gone. You never spoke to me again. Never acknowledged what happened. Shame burned through Alexander. I was afraid, he whispered. Terrified that if anyone saw me helping the gay kid, they'd figure out my secret. I know, Matthew said simply. I understood even then. Why didn't you ever tell anyone about that night? Matthew's expression softened. Because I saw something in you that you couldn't see in yourself. Kindness buried under fear. A genuine person trapped behind a mask. That night showed me that people are more complicated than they appear. That even those who hurt us might carry their own invisible wounds. Alexander blinked back tears. Is that why you became a teacher? Partly. Matthew nodded. I wanted to create the safe space I never had, to see the complicated humans behind teenage facades, to recognize the kids who are hiding, like you were, like I was. I'm so sorry, Alexander whispered, the words utterly inadequate for the weight they carried. Matthew reached across the table, his hand covering Alexander's briefly. I didn't come here for apologies. I came because that night changed me. It gave me hope when I needed it most. I wanted to know if the boy who showed me unexpected kindness was still in there somewhere. The question hung between them, unanswered but vital. Alexander stared at his reflection in the window, seeing for the first time the fortress he'd built around himself. A perfect, lonely monument to fear. In Matthew's steady gaze, he glimpsed another possibility. A life where truth didn't have to be the enemy. The realization terrified and beckoned simultaneously. Autumn painted Central Park in copper and gold as Alexander and Matthew walked its winding paths. 2 months had passed since their first meeting, and something fragile had grown between them. Not quite friendship, not quite romance, but understanding. They met weekly, cautiously at first. Matthew never pushed, never demanded Alexander step from the safety of his carefully constructed life. He simply offered space where truth could breathe. My students are putting on an event next Friday, Matthew mentioned casually as they paused on Bow Bridge. A fundraiser for the Trevor Project. When Alexander tensed, Matthew added, just thought you might want to come. No pressure. The Trevor Project, suicide prevention for LGBTQ youth. Alexander immediately calculated risks. Would anyone from the firm be there? Would attending such an event leave evidence? Would his carefully maintained facade crack if someone saw him? Yet beneath those fears, something else stirred. A longing to stand beside Matthew in the light, not hidden in safe, anonymous corners. I'll think about it, he answered, hating his own hesitation. That Monday, Alexander faced another test. Managing partner Richard Wilson called him into the mahogany-paneled office on the top floor. Sullivan, we need you on the Black Ridge Tech case. They're facing discrimination charges from former employees, some nonsense about firing staff for their lifestyle choices. Richard's fingers made air quotes, his disdain evident. The client wants our best, and that's you. Make this go away. Alexander knew Black Ridge Tech well, a Fortune 500 company with a history of discrimination complaints. The case file contained testimonies from employees fired after coming out, their lives destroyed by the same fear that ruled Alexander's existence. Taking this case meant defending the very system that kept him chained. Refusing meant jeopardizing his partnership track, maybe his entire career. I need time to review the materials, he said carefully. 3 days later, Alexander sat at his desk surrounded by case documents when his assistant knocked. There's someone here to see you. A Matthew Reynolds says he's a friend. Alexander froze, worlds colliding. Matthew stood in the reception area, casual in a blue sweater amid the firm's sea of gray and navy suits. His presence was like a bright flag in Alexander's carefully neutral territory. Colleagues glanced curiously as Alexander led Matthew to his office, feeling exposed in a way no courtroom had ever made him feel. "Sorry to ambush you at work," Matthew said once the door closed. "But you haven't answered my text about Friday's event." Alexander's jaw tightened. "This isn't a good time. It never is with you." "Alexander," Matthew replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Life happens while you're busy hiding from it." Their conversation was interrupted by Richard Wilson opening the door without knocking. "Sullivan, I need the Black Ridge strategy by—" He stopped, noticing Matthew. "Sorry to interrupt. I didn't realize you had a friend here." The way he said friend made Alexander's stomach clench. Richard's eyes moved between them, calculation visible behind his practiced smile. "Matthew was just leaving," Alexander said quickly. Matthew held Alexander's gaze for a long moment. "Think about Friday," he said quietly. "Some choices define us forever." He nodded politely to Richard and left. The next morning, Alexander sat in the firm's main conference room. The Black Ridge tech executives arrayed before him. His carefully prepared defense strategy sat untouched as CEO James Morton spoke. "These people are trying to force their agenda on my company," Morton declared. "I have family values to uphold. I can't have that kind of influence around normal employees." Alexander looked around the room at nodding heads. His gaze fell on the case files. Lives reduced to legal problems to solve. People fired simply for being themselves. People like him, like Matthew. He thought about the frightened boy he'd once been, watching from the shadows while others suffered. The man he'd become, building walls so high he could no longer see over them. "I can't take this case," he said suddenly. The room fell silent. Richard Wilson stared at him. "Excuse me." Alexander stood, smoothing his tie with shaking hands. "I'm gay." The words hung in the air, impossible to retract. "I can't in good conscience defend a company that fires people for being who they are. I won't do it." The silence that followed felt eternal, broken only by his heartbeat thundering in his ears. In that moment, Alexander Sullivan finally recognized himself. Spring sunshine bathed New York City in golden light 1 year later as Alexander Sullivan stood on a stage in Washington Square Park. The crowd stretched before him, a vibrant tapestry of colors, signs, and faces. Pride flags waved like flowers in the breeze. Matthew Reynolds stood beside him, their fingers loosely intertwined, a quiet anchor in a sea of change. Alexander had expected his world to end that day in the conference room. In some ways, it had. Wilson and Brooks had placed him on immediate leave. Former colleagues avoided him in elevators. His corner office was quietly reassigned. The partnership track he'd sacrificed everything for disappeared overnight. What Alexander hadn't expected was what would grow from those ashes. Jessica had been his first call after walking out of the firm. "I finally did it. Jess, I told the truth." Her response had been simple. "Welcome back, little brother. We've missed you." His parents had been more complicated, shock giving way to awkward questions, then tentative acceptance. Some friends disappeared. Others emerged from unexpected corners, including 3 colleagues from the firm who reached out privately, sharing their own hidden truths. Most surprising was the call from Daniel Chen, a former client who had heard about Alexander's departure. "I need someone with both legal brilliance and moral courage," Chen had said. "I want to fund an organization that provides legal support to LGBTQ youth and discrimination victims. Would you lead it?" The Second Chances Legal Fund opened its doors 6 months later in a modest office in Brooklyn. Alexander traded his bespoke suits for business casual, his 80-hour weeks for meaningful work. He still practiced law, but now represented those fighting the same battles he had feared for so long. Matthew supported him through every step, their relationship growing from understanding to love, built on the foundation of seeing each other fully. "Today, Bart," I'm honored to announce our newest initiative, Alexander told the Pride crowd, his voice steady despite the emotions swelling in his chest. The Westfield Second Chances Scholarship will provide full college funding for LGBTQ students facing financial or family challenges. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer each other isn't protection from hardship, but support through it. In the crowd, Alexander spotted Jessica beaming alongside several of his former colleagues. Nearby stood a group of Matthew's students wearing shirts with the scholarship logo. One boy in particular caught Alexander's attention, thin, serious-faced, clutching his application form like a lifeline. Alexander recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen in the mirror for too many years. Our past doesn't have to define our future, Alexander continued. Sometimes the very people who once caused pain can become champions for change. Sometimes the kindness we show in our weakest moments ripples outward in ways we never imagined. And sometimes the truth we're most afraid to speak becomes our greatest liberation. Matthew squeezed his hand, pride evident in his eyes. They had traveled a long road from that rainy night behind Westfield Academy. Victim and bystander transformed through forgiveness and courage into something neither could have imagined. I spent half my life hiding who I was, Alexander concluded. The other half I intend to spend helping others stand in their truth. Because we all deserve second chances, not just to be forgiven, but to become the people we were always meant to be. The applause washed over them like a cleansing wave. Later, as they walked through the festival hand in hand, Alexander marveled at how the weight of pretending had been replaced by the lightness of authenticity. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been right. Have you ever found courage in an unexpected place? Or discovered that a single act of kindness, given or received, changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. And subscribe to Heart Stories for more journeys of transformation. Because every life contains moments where courage and compassion can change its course forever.